Welcome to Classics You Slept Through's presentation of Wieland by Charles Brockden Brown, chapters 25 through 27. Chapter 25. A few words more, and I lay aside the pen forever. Yet, why should I not relinquish it now? All that I have said is preparatory to this scene, and my fingers, tremulous and cold as my heart, refuse any further exertion. This must not be. Let my last energies support me in the finishing of this task. Then I will lay down my head in the lap of death. Hushed will be all my murmurs in the sleep of the grave. Every sentiment has perished in my bosom. Even friendship is extinct. Your love for me has prompted me to this task, but I would not have compiled it if it had not been a luxury thus to feast upon my woes. I have justly calculated upon my remnant of strength. When I lay down the pen, the taper of life will expire. My existence will terminate with my tale. Now that I was left alone with Wieland, the perils of my situation presented themselves to my mind. That this paroxysm should terminate in havoc and rage, it was reasonable to predict. The first suggestion of my fears had been disproved by my experience. Carwin had acknowledged his offenses, and yet had escaped. The vengeance which I had harbored had not been admitted by Wieland, and yet the evils which I had endured, compared with those inflicted on my brother, were as nothing. I thirsted for his blood, and was tormented with an insatiable appetite for his destruction. Yet my brother was unmoved, and had dismissed him in safety. Surely thou wast more than man, while I am sunk below the beasts. Did I place a right construction on the conduct of Wieland? Was the error that misled him so easily rectified? Were views so vivid, and faith so strenuous, thus liable to fading and to change? Was there not reason to doubt the accuracy of my perceptions? With images like these was my mind thronged, till the deportment of my brother called away my attention. I saw his lips move, and his eyes cast up to heaven. Then would he listen and look back, as if in expectation of someone's appearance. Thrice he repeated these gesticulations and this inaudible prayer. Each time the mist of confusion and doubt seemed to grow darker and to settle on his understanding. I guessed at the meaning of these tokens. The words of Carwin had shaken his belief, and he was employed in summoning the messenger who had formerly communed with him to attest the value of those new doubts. In vain the summons was repeated, for his eye meant nothing but vacancy, and not a sound saluted his ear. He walked to the bed, gazed with eagerness at the pillow which had sustained the head of the breathless Catherine, and then returned to the place where I sat. I had no power to lift my eyes to his face. I was dubious of his purpose. This purpose might aim at my life. Alas, nothing but subjection to danger and exposure to temptation can show us what we are. By this test, I was now tried, and found to be cowardly and rash. Men can deliberately untie the thread of life, and of this I had deemed myself capable, and yet, now that I stood upon the brink of that fate, that knife of the sacrificer was aimed at my heart. I shuddered, and betook myself to any means of escape, however monstrous. Can I bear to think, can I endure to relate the outrage which my heart meditated? Where were my means of safety? Resistance was vain. Not even the energy of despair could set me on a level with that strength which his terrific prompter had bestowed upon Wieland. Terror enables us to perform incredible feats, but terror was not then the state of my mind. Where, then, were the hopes of rescue? Methinks it is too much. I stand aside, as it were, for myself. I estimate my own deservings. A hatred, immortal and inexorable, is my due. I listen to my own pleas, and find them empty and false. Yes, I acknowledge that my guilt surpasses that of all mankind. I confess that the curses of a world and the frowns of a deity are inadequate to my demerits. Is there a thing in the world worthy of infinite abhorrence? It is I. What shall I say? I was menaced, as I thought, with death, and to elude this evil, my hand was ready to inflict death upon the menacer. In visiting my house, I had made provision against the machinations of Carwin, In a fold of my dress, an open penknife was concealed. This now I seized and drew forth. It lurked out of view, but I now see that my state of mind would have rendered the deed inevitable if my brother had lifted his hand. This instrument of my preservation would have been plunged into his heart. Oh, insupportable remembrance, hide thee from my view for a time. Hide it from me that my heart was black enough to meditate the stabbing of a brother thus supreme in misery, thus towering in virtue. He was probably unconscious of my design, but presently drew back. This interval was sufficient to restore me to myself. The madness, the iniquity of that act which I had purposed rushed upon my apprehension. For a moment I was breathless in agony. At the next moment I recovered my strength and threw the knife with violence on the floor. The sound awoke my brother from his reverie. He gazed alternately at me and at the weapon. With a movement equally solemn, he stooped and took it up. He placed the blade in different positions, scrutinizing it accurately, and maintaining, at the same time, a profound silence. Again he looked at me, but all that vehemence and loftiness of spirit which had so lately characterized his features were flown. Fallen muscles, a forehead contracted into folds, eyes dim with unbidden drops, and a ruefulness of aspect which no words can describe, were now visible. His looks touched into energy the same sympathies in me, and I poured forth a flood of tears. This passion was quickly checked by fear, which had now no longer my own, but his safety for their object. I watched his deportment in silence. At length he spoke. "Sister," said he, in an accent mournful and mild, "I have acted poorly my part in this world. What thinkest thou? Shall I not do better in the next?" I could make no answer. The mildness of his tone astonished and encouraged me. I continued to regard him with wistful and anxious looks. "I think," resumed he, "I will try. My wife and my babes have gone before. Happy wretches! I have sent you to repose, and ought not to linger behind." These words had a meaning sufficiently intelligible. I looked at the open knife in his hand and shuddered, but knew not how to prevent the deed which I dreaded. He quickly noticed my fears and comprehended them. Stretching towards me his hand with an air of increasing mildness, "Take it," said he. "Fear not for thy own sake, nor for mine. The cup is gone by, and its transient inebriation is succeeded by the soberness of truth. Thou angel whom I was wont to worship, fearest thou my sister for thy life? Once it was the scope of my labors to destroy thee, but I was prompted to the deed by heaven. Such at least was my belief. Thinkest thou that the death was sought to gratify malevolence? No, I am pure from all stain. I believed that my God was my mover. Neither thee nor myself have I cause to injure. I have done my duty, and surely there is merit in having sacrificed to that all that is dear to the heart of man. If a devil has deceived me, he came in the habit of an angel. If I erred, it was not my judgment that deceived me, but my senses. In thy sight, being of beings, I am still pure. Still will I look for my reward in thy justice." Did my ears truly report these sounds? If I did not err, my brother was restored to just perceptions. He knew himself to have been betrayed to the murder of his wife and children, to have been the victim of infernal artifice, yet he found consolation in the rectitude of his motives. He was not devoid of sorrow, for this was written on his countenance, but his soul was tranquil and sublime. Perhaps this was merely a transition of his former madness into a new shape. Perhaps he had not yet awakened to the memory of the horrors which he had perpetrated. Infatuated wretch that I was, to set myself up as a model by which to judge of my heroic brother. My reason taught me that his conclusions were right, but conscious of the impotence of reason over my own conduct, conscious of my cowardly rashness and my criminal despair, I doubted whether anyone could be steadfast and wise. Such was my weakness, that even in the midst of these thoughts, my mind gilded into abhorrence of Carwin, and I uttered in a low voice, "O Carwin, Carwin, what hast thou to answer for?" My brother immediately noticed the involuntary exclamation. "Clara," he said, "be thyself. Equity used to be a theme for thy eloquence. Reduce its lessons to practice, and be just to that unfortunate man. The instrument has done its work, and I am satisfied. I thank thee, my God, for this last illumination. My enemy is thine also. I deemed him to be man, the man with whom I have often communed, but now thy goodness has unveiled to me his true nature. As a performer of thy behests, he is my friend." My heart began now to misgive me. His mournful aspect had gradually yielded place to a serene brow. A new soul appeared to actuate his frame, and his eyes to beam with preternatural luster. These symptoms did not abate, and he continued, "Clara, I must not leave thee in doubt. I know not what brought about thy interview with the being whom thou callest Carwin. For a time I was guilty of thy error, and deduced from his incoherent confessions that I had been made the victim of human malice. He left us at my bidding, and I put up a prayer that my doubts should be removed. Thy eyes were shut, and thy ears sealed to the vision that answered my prayer. I was indeed deceived. The form thou hast seen was the incarnation of a demon. The visage and voice which urged me to the sacrifice of my family were his. He now personates a human form. Then he was environed with the luster of heaven." "Clara," he continued, advancing closer to me, "thy death must come. This minister is evil, but he from whom his commission was received is God. Submit then, with all thy wonted resignation, to a decree that cannot be reversed or resisted. Mark the clock. 3 minutes are allowed to thee in which to call up thy fortitude and prepare thee for thy doom." There, he stopped. Even now, when this scene exists only in memory, when life and all its functions have sunk into torpor, my pulse throbs and my hairs uprise. My brows are knit, as then, and I gaze around me in distraction. I was unconquerably averse to death, but death, eminent and full of agony as that which was threatened, was nothing. This was not the only or chief inspirer of my fears. For him, not for myself, was my soul tormented. I might die, and no crime, surpassing the reach of mercy, would pursue me to the presence of my judge. But my assassin would survive to contemplate his deed, and that assassin was Wieland. Wings to bear me beyond his reach I had not. I could not vanish with a thought. The door was open, but my murderer was interposed between that and me. Of self-defense I was incapable. The frenzy that lately prompted me to blood was gone. My state was desperate. My rescue was impossible. The weight of these accumulated thoughts could not be borne. My sight became confused. My limbs were seized with convulsion. I spoke, but my words were half-formed. "Spare me, my brother. Look down, righteous judge. Snatch me from this fate. Take away this fury from him, or turn it elsewhere." Such was the agony of my thoughts that I noticed not steps entering my apartment. Supplicating eyes were cast upward, but when my prayer was breathed, I once more wildly gazed at the door. A form met my sight. I shuddered as if the God whom I invoked were present. It was Carwin that again intruded, and who stood before me, erect in attitude and steadfast in look. The sight of him awakened new and rapid thoughts. His recent tale was remembered, his magical transitions and mysterious energy of voice. Whether he were infernal or miraculous, or human, there is no power and no need to decide. Whether the contriver or not of this spell, he was able to unbind it and to check the fury of my brother. He had ascribed to himself intentions not malignant. Here now he was afforded a test of his truth. Let him interpose as from above. Revoke the savage decree which the madness of Wieland has assigned to heaven, and extinguish forever this passion for blood. My mind detected at a glance this avenue to safety. The recommendations it possessed thronged as it were together, and made but one impression on my intellect. Remoter effects and collateral dangers I saw not. Perhaps the pause of an instant had sufficed to call them up. The improbability that the influence which governed Wieland was external or human the tendency of this stratagem to sanction so fatal an error, or substitute a more destructive rage in place of this, the sufficiency of Carwin's mere muscular forces to counteract the efforts, and restrain the fury of Wieland might, at a second glance, have been discovered, but no second glance was allowed. My first thought hurried me to action, and fixing my eyes upon Carwin, I exclaimed, "O wretch, once more hast thou come! Let it be to abjure thy malice, to counterwork this hellish stratagem, to turn from me and my brother this desolating rage. Testify thy innocence or thy remorse, exert the powers which pertain to thee, whatever they may be, to turn aside this ruin. Thou art the author of these horrors. What have I done to deserve thus to die? How have I merited this unrelenting persecution? I adjure thee, by that God whose voice thou hast dared to counterfeit, to save my life. Wilt thou then go? Leave me, succorless." Carwin listened to my entreaties unmoved, and turned from me. He seemed to hesitate a moment, then glided through the door. Rage and despair stifled my utterance. The interval of respite was past. The pangs reserved for me by Wieland were not to be endured. My thoughts rushed again into anarchy. Having received the knife from his hand, I held it loosely and without regard, but now it seized again my attention, and I grasped it with force. He seemed to notice not the entrance or exit of Carwin. My gesture and the murderous weapon appeared to have escaped his notice. His silence was unbroken. His eye, fixed upon the clock for a time, was now withdrawn. Fury kindled in every feature. All that was human in his face gave way to an expression supernatural and tremendous. I felt my left arm within his grasp. Even now I hesitated to strike. I shrunk from his assault, but in vain. Here, let me desist. Why should I rescue this event from oblivion? Why should I paint this detestable conflict? Why not terminate at once this series of horrors? Hurry to the verge of the precipice, and cast myself forever beyond remembrance and beyond hope. Still, I live, with this load upon my breast, with this phantom to pursue my steps, with adders lodged in my bosom and stinging me to madness. Still, I consent to live. Yes, I will rise above the sphere of mortal passions. I will spurn at cowardly remorse that bids me to seek impunity in silence or comfort in forgetfulness. My nerves shall be new strung to the task. Have I not resolved? I will die. The gulf before me is inevitable and near. I will die, but then only when my tale is at an end. Chapter 26. My right hand, grasping the unseen knife, was still disengaged. It was lifted to strike. All my strength was exhausted, but what was sufficient to the performance of this deed? Already was the energy awakened, and the impulse given that should bear the fatal steel to his heart, when Wieland shrunk back. His hand was withdrawn. Breathless in a fright of desperation, I stood, freed from his grasp, unassailed, untouched. Thus long had the power which controlled the scene forborne to interfere. But now his might was irresistible, and Wieland in a moment was disarmed of all his purposes. A voice, louder than human organs could produce, shriller than language can depict, burst from the ceiling, and commanded him to hold. Trouble and dismay succeeded to the steadfastness that had lately been displayed in the looks of Wieland. His eyes roved from one quarter to another with an expression of doubt. He seemed to wait for a further intimation. Carwin's agency was here easily recognized. I had besought him to interpose in my defense. He had flown. I had imagined him deaf to my prayer and resolute to see me perish, yet he disappeared merely to devise and execute the means of my relief. Why did he not forbear when this end was accomplished? Why did his misjudging zeal and accursed precipitation overpass that limit? Or meant he thus to crown the scene and conduct his inscrutable plots to this consummation? Such ideas were the fruit of subsequent contemplation. This moment was pregnant with fate. I had no power to reason. In the career of my tempestuous thoughts, rent into pieces as my mind was by accumulating horrors, Carwin was unseen and unsuspected. I partook of Wieland's credulity, shook with his amazement, and panted with his awe. Silence took place for a moment, so much as allowed the attention to recover its post. Then new sounds were uttered from above. Man of errors, cease to cherish thy delusion. Not heaven or hell, but thy senses have misled thee to commit these acts. Shake off thy frenzy, and ascend into rational and human. Be lunatic no longer. My brother opened his lips to speak. His tone was terrific and faint. He muttered an appeal to heaven. It was difficult to comprehend the theme of his inquiries. They implied doubt as to the nature of the impulse that hitherto had guided him, and questioned whether he had acted in consequence of insane perceptions. To these interrogatories the voice, which now seemed to hover at his shoulder, loudly answered in the affirmative. Then uninterrupted silence ensued. Fallen from his lofty and heroic station, now finally restored to the perception of truth, weighed to earth by the recollection of his own deeds, consoled no longer by a consciousness of rectitude for the loss of offspring and wife, a loss for which he was indebted to his own misguided hand, Wieland was transformed at once into the man of sorrows. He reflected not that credit should be as reasonably denied to the last as to any former intimation, that one might as justly be ascribed to erring or diseased senses as the other. He saw not that this discovery in no degree affected the integrity of his conduct, that his motives had lost none of their claims to the homage of mankind, that the preference of supreme good and the boundless energy of duty were undiminished in his bosom. It is not for me to pursue him through the ghastly changes of his countenance. Words he had none. Now he sat upon the floor, motionless in all his limbs, with eyes glazed and fixed, a monument of woe. Anon a spirit of tempestuous but undesigning activity seized him. He rose from his place and strode across the floor, tottering and at random. His eyes were without moisture, and gleamed with a fire that consumed his vitals. The muscles of his face were agitated by convulsion. His lips moved, but no sound escaped him. That nature should long sustain this conflict was not to be believed. My state was little different from that of my brother. I entered, as it were, into his thought. My heart was visited and rent by his pangs. Oh, that thy frenzy had never been cured, that thy madness with its blissful visions would return, or, if that must not be, that thy scene would hasten to a close, that death would cover thee with his oblivion. What can I wish for thee? Thou who hast vied with the great preacher of thy faith in sanctity of motives and in elevation above sensual and selfish, thou whom thy fate has changed into parricide and savage, can I wish for the continuance of thy being? No. For a time his movements seemed destitute of purpose. If he walked, if he turned, if his fingers were entwined with each other, if his hands were pressed against opposite sides of his head with a force sufficient to crush it into pieces, it was to tear his mind from self-contemplation, to waste his thoughts on external objects. Speedily the strain was broken. A beam appeared to be darted into his mind, which gave a purpose to his efforts. An avenue to escape presented itself, and now he eagerly gazed about him. When my thoughts became engaged by his demeanor, my fingers were stretched as by a mechanical force, and the knife, no longer heated or of use, escaped from my grasp, and fell, unperceived, on the floor. His eye now lighted upon it. He seized it with the quickness of thought. I shrieked aloud, but it was too late. He plunged it to the hilt into his neck, and his life instantly escaped with the stream that gushed from the wound. He was stretched at my feet, and my hands were sprinkled with his blood as he fell. Such was thy last deed, my brother. For a spectacle like this was my fate to be reserved. Thy eyes were closed, thy face ghastly with death, thy arms and the spot where thou liedest floated in thy life's blood. These images have not for a moment forsaken me. Till I am breathless and cold, they must continue to hover in my sight. Carwin, as I said, had left the room, but he still lingered in the house. My voice summoned him to my aid, but I scarcely noticed his re-entrance, and now faintly recollect his terrified looks, his broken exclamations, his vehement avowals of innocence and effusions of pity for me, and his offers of assistance. I did not listen. I answered him not. I ceased to upbraid or accuse. His guilt was a point to which I was indifferent. Ruffian or devil, black as hell or bright as angels, thenceforth he was nothing to me. I was incapable of sparing a look or a thought from the ruin that was spread at my feet. When he left me, I was scarcely conscious of any variation in the scene. He informed the inhabitants of the hut of what had passed, and they flew to the spot. Careless of his own safety, he hasted to the city to inform my friends of my condition. My uncle speedily arrived at the house. The body of Wieland was removed from my presence, and they supposed that I would follow it, but no, my home is ascertained. Here I have taken up my rest, and I will never go hence, till, like Wieland, I am borne to my grave. Importunity was tried in vain. They threatened to remove me by violence. Nay, violence was used, but my soul prizes too dearly this little roof to endure to be bereaved of it. Force should not prevail when the hoary locks and supplicating tears of my uncle were ineffectual. My repugnance to move gave birth to a ferociousness and frenzy when force was employed, and they were obliged to consent to my return. They besought me, they remonstrated, they appealed to every duty that connected me with him that made me and with my fellow men. In vain. While I live, I will not go hence. Have I not fulfilled my destiny? Why will ye torment me with your reasonings and reproofs? Can ye restore me the hope of my better days? Can ye give me back Catherine and her babes? Can ye recall to life him who died at my feet? I will eat. I will drink. I will lie down and rise up at your bidding. All I ask is the choice of my abode. What is there unreasonable in this demand? Shortly I will be at peace. This is the spot which I have chosen in which to breathe my last sigh. Deny me not, I beseech you, so slight a boon. Talk not to me, O my revered friend, of Carwin. He has told thee his tale, and thou esculpest him from all direct concern in the fate of Wieland. This scene of havoc was produced by an illusion of the senses. Be it so. I care not from what sources these disasters have flowed. It suffices that they have swallowed up our hopes and our existence. What his agency began, his agency conducted to a close. He intended, by the final effort of his power, to rescue me, and to banish his illusions from my brother. Such is his tale, concerning the truth of which I care not. Henceforth, I foster but one wish. I ask only quick deliverance from life and all the ills that attend it. Go, wretch, torment me not with thy presence and thy prayers. Forgive thee? Will that avail thee when thy fateful hour shall arrive? Be thou acquitted at thy own tribunal, and thou needest not fear the verdict of others. If thy guilt be capable of blacker hues, if hitherto thy conscience be without stain, thy crime will be made more flagrant by thus violating my retreat. Take thyself away from my sight, if thou wouldst not behold my death. Thou art gone, murmuring and reluctant, and now my repose is coming. My work is done.
Chapter 27. Written 3 years after the foregoing, and dated at Montpelier. I imagined that I had forever laid aside the pen, and that I should take up my abode in this part of the world was of all events the least probable. My destiny I believed to be accomplished, and I looked forward to a speedy termination of my life with the fullest confidence. Surely I had reason to be weary of existence, to be impatient of every tie which held me from the grave. I experienced this impatience in its fullest extent. I was not only enamored of death, but conceived, from the condition of my frame, that to shun it was impossible. Even though I had ardently desired it, yet here I am, 1,000 leagues from my native soil, in full possession of life and of health, and not destitute of happiness. Such is man. Time will obliterate the deepest impressions. Grief, the most vehement and hopeless, will gradually decay and wear itself out. Arguments may be employed in vain, every moral prescription may be ineffectually tried. Remonstrances, however cogent or pathetic, shall have no power over the attention, or shall be repelled with disdain. Yet, as day follows day, the turbulence of our emotions shall subside, and our fluctuations be finally succeeded by a calm. Perhaps, however, The conquest of despair was chiefly owing to an accident, which rendered my continuance in my own house impossible. At the conclusion of my long and, as I then supposed, my last letter to you, I mentioned my resolution to wait for death in the very spot which had been the principal scene of my misfortunes. From this resolution my friends exerted themselves with the utmost zeal and perseverance to make me depart. They justly imagined that to be thus surrounded by memorials of the fate of my family would tend to foster my disease. A swift succession of new objects, and the exclusion of everything calculated to remind me of my loss was the only method of cure. I refused to listen to their exhortations. Great as my calamity was, to be torn from this asylum was regarded by me as an aggravation of it. By a perverse constitution of mind, he was considered as my greatest enemy who sought to withdraw me from a scene which supplied eternal food to my melancholy and kept my despair from languishing. In relating the history of these disasters, I derived a similar species of gratification. My uncle earnestly dissuaded me from this task, but his remonstrances were as fruitless on this thread as they had been on others. They would have withheld me from the implements of writing, but they quickly perceived that to withstand would be more injurious than to comply with my wishes. Having finished my tale, it seemed as if the scene were closing. A fever lurked in my veins, and my strength was gone. Any exertion, however slight, was attended with difficulty, and, at length, I refused to rise from my bed. I now see the infatuation and injustice of my conduct in its true colors. I reflect upon the sensations and reasonings of that period with wonder and humiliation. That I should be insensible to the claims and tears of my friends, that I should overlook the suggestions of duty, and fly from that post in which only I could be instrumental to the benefit of others, that the exercise of the social and beneficent affections, the contemplation of nature, and the acquisition of wisdom should not be seen to be means of happiness still within my reach is, at this time, scarcely credible. It is true that I am now changed, but I have not the consolation to reflect that my change was owing to my fortitude or to my capacity for instruction. Better thoughts grew up in my mind imperceptibly. I cannot but congratulate myself on the change, though, perhaps, it merely argues a fickleness of temper and a defect of sensibility. After my narrative was ended, I betook myself to bed in the full belief that my career in this world was on the point of finishing. My uncle took up his abode with me, and performed for me every office of nurse, physician, and friend. One night, after some hours of restlessness and pain, I sunk into deep sleep. Its tranquility, however, was of no long duration. My fancy became suddenly distempered, and my brain was turned into a theater of uproar and confusion. It would not be easy to describe the wild and fantastical incongruities that pestered me. My uncle, Wieland, Pleyel, and Carwin were successively and momently discerned amidst the storm. Sometimes I was swallowed up by whirlpools, or caught up in the air by half-seen gigantic forms, and thrown upon pointed rocks or cast among the billows. Sometimes gleams of light were shot into a dark abyss, on the verge of which I was standing, and enabled me to discover, for a moment, its enormous depth and hideous precipices. Anon I was transported to some ridge of Etna, and made a terrified spectator of its fiery torments and its pillars of smoke. However strange it may seem, I was conscious, even during my dream, of my real situation. I knew myself to be asleep, and struggled to break the spell by muscular exertions. These did not avail, and I continued to suffer these abortive creations till a loud voice at my bedside, and someone shaking me with violence, put an end to my reverie. My eyes were unsealed, and I started from my pillow. My chamber was filled with smoke, which, though in some degree luminous, would permit me to see nothing, and by which I was nearly suffocated. The crackling of flames and the deafening clamor of voices without burst upon my ears. Stunned as I was by this hubbub, scorched with heat, and nearly choked by the accumulating vapors, I was unable to think or act for my own preservation. I was incapable, indeed, of comprehending my danger. I was caught up in an instant by a pair of sinewy arms, borne to the window and carried down a ladder which had been placed there. My uncle stood at the bottom and received me. I was not fully aware of my situation till I found myself sheltered in the hut and surrounded by its inhabitants. By neglect of the servant, some unextinguished embers had been placed in a barrel in the cellar of the building. The barrel had caught fire. This was communicated to the beams of the lower floor, and thence to the upper part of the structure. It was discovered by some persons at a distance, who hastened to the spot and alarmed my uncle and the servants. The flames had already made considerable progress, and my condition was overlooked till my escape was rendered nearly impossible. My danger being known, a ladder quickly procured, and one of the spectators ascended to my chamber, and effected my deliverance in the manner before related. This incident, disastrous as it may seem, had in reality a beneficial effect upon my feelings. I was in some degree roused from the stupor which had seized my faculties. The monotonous and gloomy series of my thoughts was broken. My habitation was leveled with the ground, and I was obliged to seek a new one. A new train of images, disconnected with the fate of my family, forced itself upon my attention, and a belief insensibly sprung up that tranquillity, if not happiness, was still within my reach. Notwithstanding the shocks which my frame had endured, the anguish of my thoughts no sooner abated than I recovered my health. I now willingly listened to my uncle's solicitations to be the companion of his voyage. Preparations were easily made, and after a tedious passage, we set our feet on the shore of the ancient world. The memory of the past did not forsake me, but the melancholy which it generated and the tears with which it filled my eyes were not unprofitable. My curiosity was revived, and I contemplated with ardor the spectacle of living manners and the monuments of past ages. In proportion as my heart was reinstated in the possession of its ancient tranquillity, the sentiment which I had cherished with regard to Pleyel returned. In a short time, he was united to the Saxon woman, and made his residence in the neighborhood of Boston. I was glad that circumstances would not permit an interview to take place between us. I could not desire their misery, but I reaped no pleasure from reflecting on their happiness. Time and the exertions of my fortitude cured me in some degree of this folly. I continued to love him, but my passion was disguised to myself. I considered it merely as a more tender species of friendship, and cherished it without compunction. Through my uncle's exertions, a meeting was brought between Carwin and Pleyel, and the explanations took place which restored me at once to the good opinion of the latter. Though separated so widely, our correspondence was punctual and frequent, and paved the way for that union which can only end with the death of one of us. In my letters to him I made no secret of my former sentiments. This was a theme on which I could talk without painful, though not without delicate emotions. That knowledge, which I should never have imparted to a lover, I felt little scruple to communicate to a friend. 1.5 years elapsed when Teresa was snatched from him by death, in the hour in which she gave him the first pledge of their mutual affection. This event was borne by him with his customary fortitude. It induced him, however, to make a change in his plans. He disposed of his property in America, and joined my uncle and me, who had terminated the wanderings of 2 years at Montpellier, which will henceforth, I believe, be our permanent abode. If you reflect upon that entire confidence which had subsisted from our infancy between Pleyel and myself, on the passion that I had contracted and which was merely smothered for a time, and on the esteem which was mutual, you will not perhaps be surprised that the renovation of our intercourse should give birth to that union which at present subsists. When the period had elapsed necessary to weaken the remembrance of Teresa, to whom he had been bound by ties more of honor than of love, he tendered his affections to me. I need not add that the tender was eagerly accepted. Perhaps you are somewhat interested in the fate of Carwin. He saw, when too late, the danger of imposture. So much affected was he by the catastrophe to which he was a witness, that he laid aside all regard to his own safety. He sought my uncle, and confided to him the tale which he had just related to me. He found a more impartial and indulgent auditor in Mr. Cambridge, who imputed to maniacal illusion the conduct of Wieland, though he conceived the previous and unseen agency of Carwin to have indirectly but powerfully predisposed to this deplorable perversion of mind. It was easy for Carwin to elude the persecutions of Ludlow. It was merely requisite to hide himself in a remote district of Pennsylvania. This, when he parted from us, he determined to do. He is now probably engaged in the harmless pursuits of agriculture, and may come to think, without insupportable remorse, on the evils to which his fatal talents had given birth. The innocence and usefulness of his future life may, in some degree, atone for the miseries so rashly or so thoughtlessly inflicted. More urgent considerations hindered me from mentioning, in the course of my former mournful recital, any particulars respecting the unfortunate father of Louisa Conway. That man surely was reserved to be a monument of capricious fortune. His southern journeys being finished, he returned to Philadelphia. Before he reached the city, he left the highway and alighted at my brother's door. Contrary to his expectation, no one came forth to welcome him or hail his approach. He attempted to enter the house, but bolted doors, barred windows, and a silence broken only by unanswered calls showed him that the mansion was deserted. He proceeded thence to my habitation, which he found, in like manner, gloomy and tenantless. His surprise may easily be conceived. The rustics who occupied the hut told him an imperfect and incredible tale. He hastened to the city and extorted from Mrs. Banton a full disclosure of late disasters. He was inured to adversity and recovered after no long time from the shocks produced by this disappointment of his darling scheme. Our intercourse did not terminate with his departure from America. We have since met with him in France, and light has been at length thrown upon the motives which occasioned the disappearance of his wife in the manner which I formerly related to you. I have dwelt upon the ardor of their conjugal attachment, and mentioned that no suspicion had ever glanced upon her purity. This, though the belief was long cherished, recent discoveries have shown to be questionable. No doubt her integrity would have survived to the present moment if an extraordinary fate had not befallen her. Major Stuart had been engaged, while in Germany, in a contest of honor with an aide-de-camp of the Marquis of Granby. His adversary had propagated a rumor injurious to his character. A challenge was sent, a meeting ensued, and Stuart wounded and disarmed the calumniator. The offense was atoned for, and his life secured by suitable concessions. Maxwell, that was his name, shortly after, in consequence of succeeding to a rich inheritance, sold his commission and returned to London. His fortune was speedily augmented by an opulent marriage. Interest was his sole inducement to this marriage, though the lady had been swayed by a credulous affection. The true state of his heart was quickly discovered, and a separation by mutual contest took place. The lady withdrew to an estate in a distant country, and Maxwell continued to consume his time and fortune in the dissipation of the capital. Maxwell, though deceitful and sensual, possessed great force of mind and specious accomplishments. He contrived to mislead the generous mind of Stuart, and to regain the esteem which his misconduct for a time had fortified. He was recommended by her husband to the confidence of Mrs. Stuart. Maxwell was stimulated by revenge and a lawless passion to convert this confidence into a source of guilt. The education and capacity of this woman, the worth of her husband, the pledge of their alliance which time had produced, her maturity in age and knowledge of the world, all combined to render this attempt hopeless. Maxwell, however, was not easily discouraged. The most perfect being, he believed, must owe his exemption from vice to the absence of temptation. The impulses of love are so subtle, and the influence of false reasoning, when enforced by eloquence and passion, so unbounded that no human virtue is secure from degeneracy. All arts being tried, every temptation being summoned to his aid, dissimulation being carried to its utmost bound, Maxwell, at length, nearly accomplished his purpose. The lady's affections were withdrawn from her husband and transferred to him. She could not, as yet, be reconciled to dishonor. All efforts to induce her to elope with him were ineffectual. She permitted herself to love and to avow her love, but at this limit she stopped and was immovable. Hence, this revolution in her sentiments was productive only of despair. Her rectitude of principle preserved her from actual guilt. but could not restore her to her ancient affection, or save her from being the prey of remorseful and impractical wishes. Her husband's absence produced a state of suspense. This, however, approached to a period, and she received tidings of his intended return. Maxwell, being likewise apprised of this event, and having made a last and unsuccessful effort to conquer her reluctance to accompany him in a journey to Italy, whither he pretended an invincible necessity of going, left her to pursue the measures which despair might suggest. At the same time, she received a letter from the wife of Maxwell, unveiling the true character of this man and revealing facts which the artifices of her seducer had hitherto concealed from her. Mrs. Maxwell had been prompted to this disclosure by a knowledge of her husband's practices, with which his own impetuosity had made her acquainted. This discovery, joined to the delicacy of her scruples and the anguish of remorse, induced her to abscond. This scheme was adopted in haste, but effected with consummate prudence. She fled on the eve of her husband's arrival, in the disguise of a boy, and embarked at Falmouth in a packet bound for America. The history of her disastrous intercourse with Maxwell, the motives inducing her to forsake her country, and the measures she had taken to effect her design were related to Mrs. Maxwell in reply to her communication. Between these women, an ancient intimacy and considerable similitude of character subsisted. This disclosure was accompanied with solemn injunctions of secrecy, and these injunctions were, for a long time, faithfully observed. Mrs. Maxwell's abode was situated on the banks of the Wey. Stuart was her kinsman. Their youth had been spent together, and Maxwell was in some degree indebted to the man whom he portrayed for his alliance with this unfortunate lady. Her esteem for the character of Stuart had never been diminished. A meeting between them was occasioned by a tour which the latter had undertaken, in the year after his return from America, to Wales and the western countries. This interview produced pleasure and regret in each. Their own transactions naturally became the topics of their conversation, and the untimely fate of his wife and daughter were related by the guest. Mrs. Maxwell's regard for her friend, as well as for the safety of her husband, persuaded her to concealment. But the former being dead, and the latter being out of the kingdom, she ventured to produce Mrs. Stuart's letter, and to communicate her own knowledge of the treachery of Maxwell. She had previously extorted from her guest a promise not to pursue any scheme of vengeance, but this promise was made while ignorant of the full extent of Maxwell's depravity, and his passion refused to adhere to it. At this time, my uncle and I resided at Avignon. Among the English resident there, and with whom we maintained a social intercourse, was Maxwell. This man's talents and address rendered him a favorite both with my uncle and myself. He had even tendered me his hand in marriage, but, this being refused, he had sought and obtained permission to continue with us the intercourse of friendship. Since a legal marriage was impossible, no doubt, his views were flagitious. Whether he had relinquished these views, I was unable to judge. He was one in a large circle at a villa in the environs, to which I had likewise been invited, when Stuart abruptly entered the apartment. He was recognized with genuine satisfaction by me, and with seeming pleasure by Maxwell. In a short time, some affair of moment being pleaded, he required an immediate and exclusive interview. Maxwell and he withdrew together. Stuart and my uncle had known each other in the German army, and the purpose contemplated by the former in this long and hasty journey was confided to his old friend. A defiance was given and received, and the banks of a rivulet about a league from the city was selected as the scene of this contest. My uncle, having exerted himself in vain to prevent a hostile meeting, consented to attend them as a surgeon. Next morning, at sunrise, was the time chosen. I returned early in the evening to my lodgings, preliminaries being settled between the combatants. Stuart had consented to spend the evening with us and did not retire till late. On the way to his hotel, he was exposed to no molestation, but just as he stepped within the portico, a swarthy, malignant figure started from behind a column and plunged a stiletto into his body. The author of this treason could not certainly be discovered, but the details communicated by Stuart respecting the history of Maxwell naturally pointed him out as an object of suspicion. No one expressed more concern on account of this disaster than he, and he pretended an ardent zeal to vindicate his character from the aspersions that were cast upon it. Thenceforth, however, I denied myself to his visits, and shortly after he disappeared from this scene. Few possess more estimable qualities and a better title to happiness and the tranquil honors of a long life than the mother and father of Louisa Conway. Yet they were cut off in the bloom of their days, and their destiny was thus accomplished by the same hand. Maxwell was the instrument of their destruction, though the instrument was applied to this end in so different a manner. I leave you to moralize on this tale. That virtue should become the victim of treachery is, no doubt, a mournful consideration. But it will not escape your notice that the evils of which Carwin and Maxwell were the authors owed their existence to the errors of the sufferers. All efforts would have been ineffectual to subvert the happiness or shorten the existence of the Stuarts if their own frailty had not seconded these efforts. If the lady had crushed her disastrous passion in the bud and driven the seducer from her presence when the tendency of his artifices was seen, if Stuart had not admitted the spirit of absurd revenge, we should not have had to deplore this catastrophe. If Wieland had framed juster notions of moral duty and of the divine attributes, or if I had been gifted with ordinary equanimity or foresight, the double-tongued deceiver would have been baffled and repelled. This concludes Classics You Slept Through's reading and presentation of Wieland, or The Transformation, an American Tale by Charles Brockden Brown. Check out our next episode where we discuss what it is we just read. Peace.